Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created at Phaser 3. Previously, we worked on updating our data in Tiled to support multiple areas, and we built out our 2 buildings that we're now going to import into our game. If you missed the previous videos, there will be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as the police source code for this video. There will also be a link to the previous videos if you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. So now that we built out our new building and our new level data, what we need to do is we need to import those files into Phaser. So the first thing we need to go ahead and do is in our project, under our assets folder, under our data folder, we'll need to add in our 3 JSON files. So we'll have building_1, building_2, and our new main_1. For the time being, we'll leave our level.json in there, so then that way our code will continue to work, but then we'll refactor it to use our new main_1 file. In addition to our JSON files, we need to go ahead and update our images. So under our images folder, under Monster Tamer, under map, what we'll do is we're going to add a new subfolder called buildings, and we're going to go ahead and place our building 1, building 2, level, background, and foreground images. Then what we'll do is we need to go ahead and place our main_1, level, background, and foreground images under that map folder as well. For the time being, we'll leave our level_background and foreground images here until we have our code refactored, and then we'll go ahead and clean them up. Alright, so now we've added our assets to our folder. What we'll do is let's go ahead and jump over to our asset keys file, and we'll go ahead and start adding in our new files. So the first thing we'll do is let's come down to our world asset keys. And what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and rename some of these to reflect our changes from world background, and we're going to have it include our area name. And so instead of world background, we're going to do main_1 for our background. Instead of doing world main level, we're going to go ahead and do our main. We'll do 1, and we'll go ahead and do level. Then for our foreground, we're going to go ahead and do main, and we'll do 1, and let's do foreground. Then what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to drag this up here with our other ones. So we'll have our background, our foreground, and then I'm going to go ahead and update our keys to match our values. So then what we'll do is we'll want to add in our asset keys for our buildings. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this here. I'm going to paste it right below. And I'm going to go ahead and change this to building asset keys. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to building 1, background, and then we'll do the same thing for our foreground and our level. So we'll do building 1 foreground, building 1 level. I'll go ahead and update our values. I'm just going to go ahead and copy these 3, and we'll go ahead and do them down here. We're going to change it to 2. And we'll go ahead and update our values real quick, and then we'll have our new asset keys. So then let's go ahead and jump over to our preload scene, and we'll need to go ahead and fix our references. And so instead of world background, this is now going to be our main_1 background, and we'll go ahead and change this to main_1. Just going to copy that and update our reference here for our level, and then update our reference here for our level as well. So now we'll go ahead and do our main_1 level, and then our main foreground. So then after that, we want to go ahead and load in our assets tied to our buildings. I'm going to go ahead and do that right under our assets here. And so I'm going to go ahead and just copy our foreground real quick. I'm going to go ahead and paste that. I'll do our background. And then let's go ahead and do our JSON file. And then we'll go ahead and update our references. And so we're going to go ahead and change this from world asset keys. This will be our building asset keys. And then we'll go ahead and do our foreground. And we'll go ahead and just copy this. Go ahead and replace that here. And so we'll have our background, and we'll have our level. And so we'll go ahead and update our reference. We'll have map, and then we'll have buildings. What I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to copy this. Go ahead and paste that. And now we'll just have building_1. And then same thing down here. We'll have our building_1 JSON. So now let's go ahead and copy those 3 lines of code. Let's go ahead and paste them, and we'll do our building 2. And we'll go ahead and save. Oh, and so for our pass, we actually need to have our suffix of _level. So let's just go ahead and add that real quick. So we'll have main_1_level background. We'll also have that for our foreground, and we need to apply that to our buildings here as well. Alright, so after that, we just need to go ahead and update some references in our world scene. So let's go ahead and jump over there. And what we need to do is where we're referencing our world asset keys before, we need to go ahead and fix that. And so we'll have our main_1 level. We'll have our main_1 background. And then we're going to go ahead and have our main_1 foreground. So now we go ahead and save. Our game should go ahead and refresh, and everything should load like it did before. So now we have our new assets loading, and we can see our game still working. What we want to do now is we want to start adding in our support for multiple areas. And so the first thing we'll need to do is we'll need to update our data manager to keep track of where our player is at in terms of which area they're in. So currently in our data manager, we keep track of things like of our player's position in our world scene as well as their overall direction. However, now that we'll be loading multiple areas, and so we'll have multiple JSON files we need to keep track of, we'll need to know where our player was last at when they saved their game. And then that way we can load the correct JSON file that's associated with it when we come back to our game. And so to keep track of all this, what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and update our player state to go ahead and have a new field called location, and this will keep track of all that data. So what we're going to go ahead and do is, so under our player object here, we'll go ahead and add a new type. And so we're just going to copy this because we'll make a new object. And what we're going to do is we're just going to call this player location. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new type for this. And so I'm just going to copy this here, go ahead and paste this. And so instead of monster data, we're just going to call this player location. And so this will be an object. And then for our property, the first one will have a string. And so we're going to call this area. And so this is going to represent which JSON file the player is currently in. And so this would be like main_1 for our main scene here, versus if they're in the building, it'd be building_1. And then in addition to this, we're also going to add a property for knowing if our player is actually inside a building or not. And then that way we have that data if we need it. So we're just going to add a new Boolean, and we're going to do is interior. And then what we'll do is down here for our player location, we're going to reference our new type. I'm going to put that in our global state. So then we need to go ahead and update our file. So we'll have our player location. And for our first area, we're just going to start off in main_1 if we have no data. And because we're outside, this will be false for our interior. So now what we need to do is we need to go ahead and add our key to add this to our store so we can save and load our data. And so I'm just going to come up here under our player direction. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste it. And we're going to do player location. We'll update our value. So now we just need to go update this throughout our store. So let's come down here. As the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and update our existing data. So when we start a new game, we'll do our player location is going to be equal to our initial state, player location. We'll make a copy of that object. Let's come down here in our update data manager. We'll go ahead and copy this. And so we'll do our player location. And so we'll do our data, player location, and if it's not found, we're just going to add a fallback, and so we'll just copy our initial state. And then we'll have our player, and we'll have location. And then down here, we'll have our location. And then what we'll do is we're just going to make a copy, so we'll reference this, our store, and we're going to do get. We'll do our manager store keys, and then we'll do player location. So now that we have our mechanism for storing where our player is at in our game and which area they're in, we need to actually use that in our world scene. And so what we need to do is when our scene first starts, we need to know which area of the game the player is currently at. And so we'll need to go ahead and grab that data from our data manager. And then based on that data, that's going to determine which tilemap JSON file we need to use for creating our level. And it's also going to determine which foreground and background images we need to create image game objects for in our scene. So currently in our code, we're currently hard-coded to use our world asset keys for our tile JSON level and for our foreground and background images. And so we'll need that data to know which ones to load. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add some new properties to our world scene data here, because what we're going to want to do is as we transition between our areas, we're going to go ahead and reload our scene. So then that way we can recreate everything that's needed based on where our player's at in our game. And so we're going to add these properties here. So then that way, like as I enter our building here for building 1, I can say, hey, when I reload this scene, I need to go ahead and load our building 1 JSON file and our building 1 images. And then we'll be able to reuse that as well. When our scene first starts, we can go ahead and populate this data if it's not available by grabbing it from our data manager. And so to go ahead and do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 2 new properties to our world scene data. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. And so the first one we're going to add is going to be area. And this is going to go ahead and be a string. And then our second one is going to go ahead and be is interior. And then this is going to be a Boolean. And then so what we'll need to do is down in our init method, when we have our safety check to see if our scene data has no keys, we add some default values. And so what we'll want to do is now we'll want to check to see if certain keys are not available and then grab those from our data manager if they are not. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to add some code down below this. And so the first thing we'll do is go ahead and do our area. And so for our area, what we're going to want to do is we'll do const area, and this is going to be equal to our scene data if it was provided. If it was provided, we want to go ahead and use the area property that was available. If area is undefined, then we want to go ahead and fall back to use our data manager. So we'll do our data manager, we'll reference our store, we'll use our get method, and we'll use our data manager store keys, and we want to get our player's location. And then we want to go ahead and grab the area property from this. And so I'm just going to go ahead and add our type. So we have that. And so for our type, this is going to go ahead and be our string. And so next we'll need to go ahead and do interior. So we'll do a similar thing. We'll do const, we'll do is interior. We're going to set this equal to this, our scene data. We'll make sure it's available. And then we'll do is interior, and we'll add a fallback. So we'll do data manager. Actually, I'm just going to copy this here. And we'll want to grab is interior from our player location. Then finally, we're going to go ahead and do the same thing with our is player knocked out. And that way we can just use the same pattern. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. I'm going to go ahead and paste this. And we'll do const is player knocked out. We're going to grab that property. Otherwise, we'll default to false. So then what we can do is we'll do this. We'll do our scene data is going to be equal to our area is player knocked out is interior. And then we can go ahead and get rid of this code here. All right, so what that'll do is that's going to go ahead and use whatever data we pass in to our scene when it starts, and then it'll fall back to using our default values if it's not provided. All right, so real quick, I'm just going to go ahead and move this, our wild monster encounter, down here where we set our other values. So now what we'll want to do is after we now have our new scene data, we'll want to go ahead and update our data manager. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to go ahead and set our area and is interior based on our scene data. And the reason we're going to go ahead and do that is if that data is provided to our scene when we initialize it, we want to make sure we keep that in sync with our data manager. And so all we're going to go ahead and do is right down here, we're just going to do our data manager. We'll grab our store and we'll do set. So we'll do our data manager store keys. Let's go ahead and do our player location. And now for our data, we're going to go ahead and do area, and this is going to be equal to our scene data, area. And we'll do interior, and we'll do this, our scene data, and is interior. So now that we have the right area data when our scene is initialized, we need to go ahead and make some updates to our create method so that we create the appropriate game objects. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and comment out some code, and we'll come back and clean this up. And so what we're going to do is we're going to comment out the stuff that's tied to our camera and for positioning it, because what we'll end up doing is after our scene starts, we need to position our player at the appropriate entrance for where they enter one of our buildings or exit, and then we'll have our camera center on our player game object, and so we don't need to actually specify our position. Likewise, for our bounds, this is going to be dynamic depending if we're using our main _1 area JSON file or if we're using one of our interior files. Because if our interior files, our areas are much smaller than our area currently. And so next, what we want to do is anytime we reference our world asset keys and we're grabbing one of our files, now we want to grab the appropriate file based on our area. And so instead of our world asset keys main _1 level, we want to go ahead and change our key. And so for our key, this is going to go ahead and be this, our scene data, and it's going to be our area. And what we'll do is we'll do 2 uppercase, and that way it'll match our asset key that we provided. And then we want to go ahead and add our level _ suffix. All right, so we save. It looks like we have an issue in our code. Let's jump back up to our data manager. And in our update data manager, so for our player location, we're accidentally copying our direction. So what we want to do is actually copy our location. So now we save, our scene should refresh, and there should be no issues. And now what we'll want to do is we want to go ahead and update our background and our foreground image references as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and copy this here. And then so when we add in our background, what we'll do is we're going to do our area uppercase, but instead of level, we're going to do background. And then we'll go ahead and copy this. We want to do the same thing for our foreground. So we'll come down here, we'll create our foreground, and we'll go ahead and update our reference. So we'll have foreground. So if we go ahead and save, our scene should refresh, and we should still have the correct images being loaded. However, one thing we'll notice is now we're more zoomed in on our game. So what we'll want to do is we're going to copy some of that code we commented out before, and we're just going to go ahead and move it. So what we'll do is we're going to copy the set bounds, and we're going to copy our set zoom, and we'll come right down to right above where we create our background, and we'll go ahead and paste those 2 lines of code. And so first, let's go ahead and do our set zoom for our camera. All right, looks much better. And now for setting our bounds, what we want to do is we want to wrap this in our check. And if our scene data is not interior, then we want to go ahead and set our bounds. And so let's go ahead and do not. We'll go ahead and save. And then that should still work like it was before. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to try referencing our building _1 level and see if we can get our code to work. So what we'll do is let's come up to our init method. And when we set our scene data, what we'll do real quick is we're going to change area. We're going to hard code this to be building _1. All right, so if we go ahead and save our changes, we should see our scene refresh, but we'll see some errors in our console. And so what we're going to see is we're going to see some errors tied to when we try to create certain layers in our game. And what's happening is currently in our code, we're assuming that our level data has a layer called sign, and we try to go ahead and then create this. We don't find that layer in our JSON data for our buildings because there's no signs in our current level. And so what we're going to want to do is we want to refactor where we're calling get object layer in a few locations to first make sure that layer actually exists. And if that layer does exist, then we run our code that we did before. If that code does not exist, then we go ahead and just ignore it. And then that way our world scene code will work with both our current main _1 level and our building levels. And so to actually do this, what we're going to do is we're going to use our method for getting our object layer. And if it's not found, it's going to come back as null. And so we're just going to make a new variable to have this check, and we'll do const has sign layer. We're going to set that equal to our map, and then get object layer sign. And we'll say if it doesn't equal null, then it'll be true. If it is null, then it'll be set to false. And then what we can do, we'll do if we have our sign layer, then we can go ahead and assign our sign layer to our variable. And then what we can actually do is we can go ahead and get rid of this logic here. And we don't need our console log because we have that safety check. We don't need that anymore. So then what we'll do is we're also going to do that in our encounter layer. So I'm just going to copy this here and we'll come down here. And so we'll do has encounter layer. Change this to be encounter. And now let's do our if. We'll do if has encounter layer. We'll go ahead and wrap our code. And then we don't need this here because we're doing our check above. And we'll go ahead and save. And then what we'll also want to do is we want to go ahead and move our logic for our encounter tiles to be inside our if logic here. So I'm just going to copy this. And so if we have our encounter layer, we'll go ahead and do this. And we expect our encounter tiles to exist. Otherwise, we can't create our layer here. All right, so go ahead and save and refresh. We'll see now our scene loads. We can see our player, but we just see a black screen. And what's happening is we're creating our image game objects, but currently our player's position is very far down in our world scene. And so we can't actually see our building. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to come to where we have our player position. And so when we create our player, I'm just going to go ahead and comment this out real quick. And we're just going to go ahead and hard code a value so we can just do some testing. And so we'll have for X, we'll do 0. And for our Y, let's go ahead and do 0. And we'll place our player near the top of our scene. And so what we'll see now is when our scene loads, we can see our interior building and our player is visible. We'll just need to add in logic to actually have our player appear in the correct location once we connect this to our world scene. But the good news is, with just that little bit of refactoring, we can see now that we can support our multiple level JSON files, and we can load the correct one dynamically just based on some properties in our world scene. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and revert that change for our position, and then I'm going to come back up to our init method, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that hard-coded building 1, and that we use our correct area, so we can go ahead and continue testing. All right, so the last thing we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to come back up to our class definition where we create some of our layer data here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some of these have undefined, so they're optional, because now that we have our check in our code, if that layer doesn't exist, then we don't actually assign these properties in our create method. And this will just help us track to know that these will be optional in some of our levels. And then that way in our code, we know to handle that properly. And so we have our encounter layer. And then we'll also have our sign layer that can be undefined. And then what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to look for references of those. So then that way we can just have our optional check here for when we try to grab that property. And so we'll have our private encounter layer. And so we have that checked inside here where we assign it. And then if it's not defined, we don't do this logic here. Perfect. And then we just need to add a check for our sign layer. And so we assign it, and we have one other reference. Here, yes. So this will actually cause us issues, because if it's undefined, we'll have problems. And so we'll just add our optional check here, and then that way we won't run this code if sign layer doesn't exist. All right, so just a quick recap of what we did is the first thing we did was we enhanced our data manager to go ahead and have a new field called player location. And in this field, we store two properties, area and is interior. And so this is just metadata referring to our world and which level JSON file and images we need to load for where our player is currently located in our game. And so by default, we set these to our main_1, so that way when we start a brand new game, our player is going to go ahead and spawn in our world scene where we expect him to, and we'll know that he's outside. Then what we do is in our world scene, now we dynamically create our game objects and reference the correct tile JSON file based on those properties. And then that way, if we change that area, we then load the correct values and display those game objects to our player. And so now just to round everything out, what we'll have to do next is we need to go ahead and add support in our game for when our player interacts with one of our doors. We can then transition to that building and we'll reload our world scene, and then we can see everything connected end to end. All right, with that, that brings this video to an end. In our next video, we'll wrap up our logic for having our transitions from our world scene to our building scene. And we'll allow our player to go into one of our buildings, and we'll show that in our game. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the complete source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see the links on your screen now.